history and development of oral culture, which again was more of a group work. It had a lot of characteristics of collectivism. And then we moved on to writing culture, which started to develop a little bit of individualism. Now, we're gonna move on to print culture. So, and it gets more and more individualistic by the second. One person could carry the production or could carry selling this product. How is it that we call the church monopolized knowledge? Means that they were the only people responsible to distribute knowledge among people. Now imagine you have a whole country and only one institution carries this knowledge. Now again, imagine something like as big as Vancouver and only, for example, only UBC could educate you. There's no other educational institution. Or for me, Nurhan is the only person who is capable of sending you material. So that's basically what monopoly of knowledge is. So that was pretty much the problem of writing that was facing Europe at that time. Again, there was the church only monopolized knowledge. They are the ones who gave approval to books and only few people could copy that book. Parchment was too expensive and Latin was used by the elite people. So as you mentioned, this is what the parchment looked like. So this finally by the 13th century, people started to adopt writing. It was still by hand, but it was for more administrative purposes. What we say here, the local feudal lords, mostly people who would, again, they would travel across Europe. So they needed, again, a recording system. There were merchants, merchandisers who would, again, sell and buy products. We still needed a recording system. So they used their own vernacular language. What is a vernacular language? It's a language that, like you guys, for example, would have in India, where each state would have their own accent or would have their own language. So that was pretty much, it was pretty similar. They couldn't have their own official language, so they developed their own language to use it in the market. So merchants, so at that time, merchants like banking or courts, they started to use writing, and then it started to spread to shopkeepers or shop owners, local nobilities like noble people, but they're a little bit less than actual noble, and so on. Now, like we mentioned, because they did not know Latin, they started to write in their own language, or they started to write in their own accent. So vernacular is when each region has its own spoken language or has its own spoken dialect or accent. So by time, Latin actually started to lose its essence. Now, I'm going to draw something over here that I believe is important to understand. We're just going to clear the drawings. Okay. Now you have, okay, you have a triangle. Most of you could know, look at the hierarchical system. Again, not very great spots or writing. Okay, so over here we had, of course, the king and queen. So we had the very top. And over here we had like knights, we had barons. Here we have local nobilities. And then finally we have the all other citizens. And of course, you can already guess that all other citizens that are down there are pretty much poor. They're the poorer of the triangle. Now over here, this part we have the church. Basically, the church helped maybe something like the queen and the knights and barons to control things, monopolize things, keep people under pressure or keep the citizens under pressure, keep them most of the time uneducated, so they wouldn't know, of course, their rights and responsibilities, right? Imagine again, if you are the owner of a big factory, and something like Apple or something like Sony, they have their factories in poor areas. So it could in South America, where they exploit workers who don't know how to read and write most of the time. And when you don't know how to read and write, you don't know, again, how can you sign a contract to work there? How can you know your rights? How can you know your responsibilities? So people actually, unfortunately, they exploit workers because they're just cheap. This is exactly what happened back in the day over here. So Latin was the spoken language for the top people. But time by time, all of the people down there moved to vernacular languages or the local languages. So by time Latin started to die and people started to replace Latin bit by bit with their everyday accent or everyday dialect. So Latin just simply, it started to, lose its hold. It's not as powerful as before, and it just started to grow. This other accent started to grow. So by the end of the 13th century and beginning of the 14th century, the local feud leaders and merchants, as we mentioned, because they're the ones who were traveling, they were the ones who were needed for recording, they really started to adopt writing because it was, again, it was so easy to use it. We needed to keep records and so on. Paper became a medium of writing in the Eastern cultures. So it started from China, it moved to India, it moved to Japan, and so on. So a lot of other writing cultures started to move out. And then it gradually moved to Europe by trade networks, meaning that people would travel for trading, and then they found out, hey, look at this, there's paper. Let's take it with us. Now, paper was invented in China around 105 AD, so the year before Jesus was born. So the widespread of writing would have not been possible at all without a medium that was, first of all, we wanted a medium that was cheap. There was, inexpensive to produce, and of course we wanted something that we don't want to carve stones because it's just going to be very difficult to move. So paper made it so much easier. It was inexpensive. It worked better than parchment. It became, again, a substitute that was invented in China and traveled all the way to Europe. So they invented in China in 105, and it took over 1,000 years to reach Spain. Now take a look at this photo. Now here, let's just zoom a little bit. It was invented in China in 105, right? And it moved to Tibet almost 200 years later. Then it went to Japan. We're all talking, by the way, how it moved. It simply moved by, again, people who were travelers, workers, basically sellers, shop owners, and so on. Then the Islamic forces, it spread throughout the Muslim world in South Europe and East and North Africa. So they had a lot of paper makers over there. And then so it was Islamic forces by 751, all the way to the Moors in Spain and Portugal in 12,000, and then finally Germany, England, and Sweden. Now look at the dates. It was invented in China 105, and then it entered England 1494. That's over 1,400 years, which is a really, really big number. So another question that I want you to think about, why do you think it took over 1,000 years to reach Europe? Now, what is print? Now let's talk about print as an invention. It's basically multiplication of what we call graphically stored information by mechanical means. There's a lot of types of printing, such as block printing, woodcut, and illustration, seals, and movable type. I'm pretty sure maybe when you were young, I mean, I had this toy when I was a little girl. It was stamps with different shapes. It was basically blocks with different shapes and different color, and there was ink with different colors and so on. Then I would put the block on the ink, and then I would transfer it to paper. That is a type of print. Again, you put blocking, there's seals, movable type, and so on. So print started as seals. These are seals. Take a look at those. Now these seals, you might have seen it maybe in movies or in TV shows. They were basically simultaneously as autographs and property marks. So when the king writes a letter or writes a contract that this property belongs to him, he puts the seal. Maybe you have seen it in some TV shows, something like Games of Thrones, for example. So you would know that they would say, oh, this is that is a type of print. Again, you put blocking, there's seals, movable type, and so on. So print started as seals. These are seals. Take a look at those. Now these seals, you might have seen it maybe in movies or in TV shows. They were basically simultaneously as autographs and property marks. So when the king writes a letter or writes a contract that this property belongs to him, he puts the seal. Maybe you have seen it in some TV shows, something like Games of Thrones, for example. So you would know that they would say, oh, this is the king's seal, right? So this is something that belonged to a specific person. Now they represent a genesis of print. They could be for individuality, for authority, for ownership, like again showing the king, as the king, he's the highest of them all, or authorship, like you have authority over something, like a judge or a lawyer or something, and of course ownership. In Sargon era of ancient Sumer, we've mentioned ancient Sumer earlier, they were used as a way to mark property and anchor ownership of a property. Like again, I have a contract here, and this contract is written in a sheet of paper, and I have the seal that says this belongs to me. There was other early forms of print that came from China and Korea and Japan using wooden blocks. So it's something similar to the picture that we have right here. Movable type, of course, there was clay, metal, or porcelain. The only problem that was, they were, of course, it was easy, as a method, it was pretty easy than hand copying it every single time, but it was very difficult in other things. So first of all, it was highly labor intensive. Maybe I'm going to write those down for you guys. Let me just clear those. Okay, so this block printing, not as successful. All right, so we have a number of reasons. Now the first one is highly intensive labor. Now imagine that you are required to carve stones. Each had to be engraved by hand, and you couldn't only do one, you had to do hundreds of them. So it had to be engraved by hand. So I had to have maybe more than one person to do it. Engraved by hand. The other one that makes it even more difficult is that, let's say you're engraving something and you slipped, you made a mistake. If the worker made a mistake, maybe even like a spelling mistake, what would happen next? You would either have to do the entire block or forget about it, and then you'll have hundreds of copies with that mistake. So redo the entire block, or So that was one of the problems within the block printing. We weren't sure exactly, again, how to use it, make it easier to use, and so on. Some of you said, thank you for mentioning that. So since you said not easy to carry, not portable, block printing is very expensive because of labor. That's good because you need to pay for all of those people. It's non-reversible. Right? So that's, again, movable, and block printing is not very easy. But do you remember when we were talking about critical thinking earlier before the break? With a little bit of critical thinking, they decided, you know what, instead of writing thousands of, of blocks, let's create molds from specific letters or specific words. Of course, it was easy. It was very easy in the English language, or like the European language, because there were limited number of letters, such as, A, B, C, D. So they said, okay, yeah, I can make the alphabetical letters. I can make it in maybe capital and small writing. Okay, so if I have like 26 letter, I can make what, is it going to be like 43, I think, if we're going to double it, capital letters and small letters. 43 is not bad, I can do that. And maybe even make phrases like good morning, good night, maybe even for festivals or celebrations, like specific statements or specific word. Now, it was easy in the English language because, like we said, had 26 letters, but of course it was very difficult in non-alphabetical writing, such as Chinese. The Chinese writing at that time, they had 40,000 characters. So it was very difficult to make 40,000 blocks. Now look at this statement. Why did we need print after all? Inventions become effective only if existing social and economic conditions have already created a need for them, if society is ready for their use. Now, there's a lot of debate about why did they really needed print, because a lot of things. Now, the first one here is the growth of secular education. A lot of authorities and other people decided that they do not want the church to be the only institution responsible for education, but we want other education as well. So there were more secular education growing by the minute. Wealthy private book collectors started to grow in numbers, and they wanted to collect rare books and rare manuscripts. And finally, the church decided to give up and they said, you know what? That's fine. If people are asking for print and they're going to get it from outside, maybe we're going to give it to them instead. So again, think about how come inventions become effective only if existing social and economic conditions have created a need for them. Think about something like Zoom. People wouldn't really need Zoom unless there was an economic and a social condition that required people to use Zoom. People have been using Zoom for a few years, but not very, excessively. But recently, everyone has been using it, and even the company has been developing more and more like security, bandwidth for more people to use it. So the Zoom as an invention became more effective because there was a huge need for it, which is an existing social condition. So think about printing. What kind of social and economic condition really pushed for the invention of print? This question could come to you in the final exam as an essay question to apply it on something. I'll give you the statement like inventions become effective only if existing social and economic conditions have already created a need for them. Apply it on something like Facebook. Apply it on different social media applications. That social media application is an invention. What kind of social and economic condition that asked to create something like the social media? Now, the history and development of print. Now, there's a lot of debate that we said who really invented print. Was it the Chinese? Was it the Europeans? Who was it? China had the very basis of what print looks like, but the one who was actually accredited for it was Johannes Gutenberg between 1440 and 1460. Gutenberg was originally a goldsmith. So you can see here that is a look of what the printing press looked like at the beginning. And this is the recreated press at the International Printing Museum in California. So again, like we said, the growth of secular education, interests of wealthy private book collectors, the needs of the church, to answer this question, created conditions for a market in both in books, manuscripts, and in Europe. All right. So again, because how Gutenberg was a very skilled goldsmith, Gutenberg, what we call this, again, this is a very just historical part. You don't really need to study it, but just a little bit of a background story. Gutenberg devised a system including reusable metal prints or like unit blocks so that they could be rearranged to print any text using ink. Now again, it was a great method. It was a method for rapidly producing multiple copies of the same text or of the same essay. Now you can see here the impact of press in Europe was pretty big. Now that cities with printing in 1450 was just Germany because this is where it was invented. But we move on, only 50 years. Look at this, look how many printing presses over here. Again, a little bit of background story. I don't know if you guys have taken 130, like Communication 130, but there was this huge story called the Luther's 95 Theses. Now, it essentially, now again, remember when we said the church was really monopolizing knowledge, and it was very strict, and it was very powerful. Now, Luther, he wrote a thesis that basically declared war on the authority of the church, and it launched Reformation, right? What he did is that he wrote the thesis to tell people. Now again, remember when we said writing helps in critical thinking, so all of these points are really connected together. He wrote a thesis, and it was printed with the printing press. It was a lot of copies throughout the printing press, and it basically was telling people that you cannot stay under control by the church. The church is controlling information, controlling science, controlling religion, and so on. So the printed text disseminated to thousands of people, to hundreds of cities around Germany, and they had their messages shared more widely, more rapidly than ever, and that caused a revolution and a reformation on the church. So in less than 50 years, the press had a transformation impact in European society, and it was a huge instrument in the dramatic society and political upheaval. So I personally believe, again, the printing press is one of the most important inventions throughout Europe because it put a lot of basis for everything else, for a lot of other things. Printed is that it put basis for so many inventions after that, including telegraph. Now, some of the impacts of the press of Europe, there's a lot of different directions on the effects of print, and we're gonna see one about like religion and science and people, but let's look about the general direction. So of course, because of the print, there was circulation of democratic and new religion ideologies. Now again, people are now with the Bible. We're speaking about so the Bible again. The problem with the church is that there were no other copies of the Bible outside of the church. There was only few copies inside of the church. If you want to read them, you travel all the way from wherever you are to the church and read the Bible. Now, of course, you only have limited time. You cannot take it home with you, and it's only inside the church. After the printing press was developed, They said, well, you know what? Let's actually print so many copies of the Bible so people can, they don't have to go to the church and they can read it on their own. And this is when people start to have their new religion ideologies, meaning that I don't have to read the Bible under someone's control. I can read it on in my own time. I can focus on one part and leave the other, like we said earlier in the advantages of writing. And I can take my time reading things. And this is when new ideologies started to develop. Like they really started to get their own ideological thinking. Now again, imagine that me as Nurhan, let's say I'm the one who's monopolizing knowledge right now, and you actually cannot get access to your material, but I'm the only one who can give you access, basically. Okay. And then once we are done with the class, by when it comes 12:15, you don't get access to this material anymore. I shut it off. And I only give you access specific time per week. So of course it's gonna put you, first of all, because it put you a lot of pressure. You only have a small limited time to read and understand the material. You don't have extra time to refocus on something, but rather than, again, those 3 or 4 hours. But then imagine suddenly someone else, someone who's like not me, tells you, hey guys, look, I have all the material that Nurhan is not providing. I'm going to give it to you. I'm not going to have control over you anymore, because before that I can control you. I can tell you, you can only, yes, for example, I tell you, you can only get good grades if you only read from my material, and I give you very limited time to give you this material. But then when someone else tells you, hey, you don't have to stick to Nurhan's material, I'll give you more material that's more understandable, you'll be like, okay, Nurhan, we don't have to come to your class anymore. That's basically how they started to take away the power of the church, because of, again, they having their own time to understand, which comes here. So again, there was rapid circulation, more circulation of knowledge, which again took away the authority of the church. And this is a really, really important point that I want you guys to focus on. So it undermined the political and ideological authority of the church. There was a huge rise of nationalism, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and of course, commercial press. We want to be able to make money of the printing press. There was a spread of trading information, of course, expansion of marketing, enabling colonial exploits around the world. Simply, the press made it so much easier to share information. How did people view religion after all of these changes? Now imagine, again, put yourself in the minds of people that you have been lied to for ages, right? I've been lying to you about everything, about science, about philosophy, about the universe. I've been lying to you about a lot of things. And then suddenly you found out the truth, and you found out that church has been lying to you about all of these things. How are you going to feel about this? Like, I've been lied to. I've been cheated on. The church has been feeding me with lies. One of the reasons the church has been telling us, again, like Karen mentioned, to stay in power. The king and queen wanted to stay in power, so they collided with the church to keep the people under pressure. Now, of course, there's a lot of various changes in both. So one of the very first changes of print is the books. Of course, now we had the idea of capital and lower cases. There was punctuation, spaces, index. So there was a whole new looks for the books. Looks for the books. It kind of rhymes. Now, that was similar to the way that they used to write, right? They didn't understand how important punctuation is, how important spacing was. Of course, print made it so much easier to have other jobs. So now, not only print shops grew in labors, there were specific skills done by specific people in order, right? So again, making the idea of not just multitasking, but the idea of proper order. New libraries were founded, old libraries increased. Again, they were the catalogs idea, like how are we going to order our books? First name, last name, is it going to be by genre? What are we going to do? There was, of course, huge political, social, and political consequences. How, of course, taking control from the church. Printing had new possibilities. Now, again, imagine I just keep talking about things over and over and over again, right? Versus you actually have the paper with you to read and take your time reading. Which one is going to make it easier for you when you want to understand something slowly and clearly? Me talking or you reading? Let's say again, I am a very corrupted ruler, okay? I don't give you material, I don't give you content. So you're not gonna know, right? Basically, what happens is I am giving you my opinions, right? And I'm telling you, here is the scientific fact. The sun is not the center of the universe, right? And you have no proof. So you're like, okay, I believe Nurhan because I don't know anything else, right? Now, or I'm telling you, I'm giving you false information. So not only I'm giving you false information, I'm giving you my opinion. Time by time, you're going to believe in my opinion and you're going to take it as your own opinion, right? But if you have material, you're just going to read and be like, I can actually build my own opinion depending on what I've been reading. Yeah. People sometimes, celebrities could have an opinion and people could actually, like fans or audiences, could actually think that their opinion is correct and this is my opinion as well. Do you remember opinion leaders from week 2? So that's pretty much the same thing. I am an opinion leader, so the church was an opinion leader, and then all of my followers are actually following the same opinion. And that's why it's important to know that print helped in having new interpretations. People are reading slowly, carefully, and now they are building their own opinions. The search again for knowledge and ability to compare text was easier because again, you have the material in your own hand. I can take my time reading and going over all of the messages over and over again. And of course, development of more secular society away of the religious life. We also talked about the differences. So you guys had a lot of interesting thoughts about old newspapers. This is actually one of the very first newspapers in London in 1668. So like the font, of course, this one is daily. This one, look at here. It's 3 days from Monday to Thursday because the print, of course, was not as advanced as today. It was all black and white, no pictures, the font was different, and so on. Right, so other changes, or are there like specific changes? It was already mentioned in the writing culture, but individualism developed even more with printing. Again, it talked about how the oral tradition started to really disappear, and individuals became even more isolated. Marshall McLuhan, who was Canadian, by the way, he said that media, or the advancement of media, makes us more isolated, more discreet, more detached. Do you guys agree or disagree with the statement? Take it a little bit more with not just stopping at printing and writing, but advancement of television, media, applications, smartphones. It makes that even more and more and more isolated. And not only everything is written, but again, it allows you for more, again, critical thinking. It allows you for more opinion, observation, and so on. The rise of individualism, rise, of course, of nationalism and capitalism. Now, of course, feudal loyalties were broken down. What feudal means, again, the control of king and queen over the country. So they were broken down because people, again, started to really, again, know what my right as a citizen are. Workers, there was a lot of slavery in Europe. Workers started to sell my labor, like if I'm going to actually do some labor work, means that I need to get paid for my work. Spread of capitalism, of course, there was more transportation, transmission of money, contracts, legal documents, and so on. And of course, switching to the nation state means that the feudality were broken down, there was more democracy in the elections, and so on. On a more personal level, print helped to expand one's horizon. Now, people did not, again, because of the low amount of literacy, they didn't know about other cultures, they didn't know about other languages. So it helped people to acknowledge more about worlds across me, or other countries or cultures across me. There's, of course, change in religion. If the church, again, kept them blind and completely following them, what happens once they start reading books and science? The monopoly of the church started to break down. There was a lot of secularization of knowledge, meaning that putting science away from religion, and of course, other understanding of what is God, what is religion, how am I supposed to react to it. Instead of the church telling me how to feel about it, I get to know how to feel about it. Of course, more rationalism means people started to have, again, their own rationality in ideas and so on. Again, the shift from religion to science. Marshall McLuhan, again, we'll get to see him a little bit more, says that communication via writing is a displaced activity, which is imperialistic and paradoxical. So imperialistic means that it's powerful and influential, and paradoxical means that it's opposite but has a logical conclusion. So let's see what he meant with the statement. So displaced, it displaces you, writing and reading. Now, the process of writing and reading is a very individual activity. Most of the time when you're reading something, it might be a little bit difficult to focus if someone else is talking, right? Like imagine you're reading a book or a story or even your material and someone is talking beside you. Most of the time, it's going to be a little bit difficult to focus on both things. So it displaces you from the group of which is a part of. When you also read or write something, there is no present audience. So when I'm writing a book or a story or a novel, I could be writing about a place that doesn't exist. I'm writing to audience who are not immediately present. So again, it displaces the writer from the surrounding, and it also displaces the reader from the surroundings. In imperialistic means, again, it's powerful. So unlike all oral cultures, it permits other activities. For example, you could see, for example, your grandmother sewing or knitting some clothes and talking to her auntie or to her friend or to your mother at the same time. Cooking, you can still talk while cooking. So talking actually could permit you to do multitask. But reading or writing, most of the time, or like 90% of the time when you're reading or writing something, it happens alone. So it's a very powerful activity that needs its alone time. Again, sometimes you can do it, but most of the time it's difficult when you want to focus on reading or writing a specific item. And finally, paradoxical means that it's opposite. Now, remember when we said at the very beginning of our semester, communication is a social process, right? Communication happens between two people or more. But when you're communicating with a book, you're not really talking to someone. It's not really a social process. Yes, there's a sender, there's a receiver, there is feedback, there's even noise, someone interrupting you when you're reading, but it's not a social process. So that's what we mean by paradoxical. The communication of reading and writing is done alone, but then we also talk about communication being a social process. So it's a very interesting statement that I think has a lot of interesting meaning, that Marshall McLuhan was talking about writing. Again, writing, he thinks that writing is a very powerful medium that has its own understanding and has its own elements. Now, the final thing that Marshall McLuhan says about writing, the interiorization. Now, When, of course, in the word, again, I want you to focus on this word interiorization because it gets even more and more with electronic media. So he referred to interiorization of communication technologies. You have your own ideas, your own thoughts, and your own opinions, and then you put it on your by writing or by screen or by print. Now imagine again what happens to us nowadays. We are glued to our phone, right? And what happens? We're like texting, 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 texting all the time. What happened here? Our consciousness and our thoughts and our minds and our opinions take these characteristics of the medium. So, like we said before, individuals become more discrete, separate units, and we're very alone in the now last time before the pandemic, last time when you guys would go to a SkyTrain, what happens? Everyone is glued to their phone, right? So we're very discreet. Now, oral tradition, remember when we talked about oral tradition, how it has music, it has songs, it has rhythm, it has a lot of independency on each other. Writing culture is characterized by partistic. Now, oral culture looks at ideas as a whole, but writing culture looks at small parts. So people or the readers are able to look at things one part at a time, and of course, ask questions one part at a time. Like when you did earlier, for example, I'm pretty sure that you would be, when I ask you to go, check your material, you would go take one slide at a time to go over them and see if you have questions over each slide, right? You don't take the whole thing as writing as a whole, like, Nurhan, explain to me the writing culture as a whole, but rather you would go each on every slide and be partistic, means that you're taking each part to develop opinions and to develop questions and so on.